So, Unit 7 is the title A New Deal, A New Weapon, and a New World Order. The significance behind this unit, or significant topics, is going to be the New Deal, so trying to fix the Great Depression, World War II, both our involvement and then the fallout of that, including the acquisition of a new weapon, an atomic bomb. And then a kind of segueing into what will really define a lot of more modern American history, which is going to be tensions with the Soviet Union, a Cold War, as we kind of emerge as a dominant world power. So an essential question for the entire unit: how did the isolationist United States emerge as a world power in the mid-20th century? It's important for us to keep in mind that while we currently think of America as a world power, and that's a given, really, America was isolationist well up into World War II. Now, we saw last unit some dabbling with that, right? Some moving, pushing, moving the boundaries a little, but kind of being isolationist. And that's going to end this unit. A question for us today: how did President Roosevelt increase the size of the federal government in an attempt to pull the United States out of the Great Depression? See, the significance is the Great Depression was happening. FDR came in on, as you can see there, a clear mandate to fix this. You can see the 1932 results there. Hoover lost significantly. But it is important for us to keep in mind how elections don't maybe tell a full story, right? Or just the electoral vote. So if you look at all of that, huge swaths of blue, you can clearly see America has spoken. And if you look at the popular vote, though, 43% went with someone else. And what's hard for us is looking at that map with all that blue, it's hard to say that that only looks like 57% of the people in America wanted this. But there is that majority throughout the whole country. That's the significance. We're not seeing really any, you can see a little bit in the Northeast, but you really see the whole country, especially that North and South divide we've been following, go, yeah, now Hoover sucks. Let's do something else. And there's also going to be the creation of the 20th Amendment. This is called the Lame Duck Amendment. We just went through a process of this. So Biden won the election on November, that Saturday they announced it. And he was elected the president, but he didn't become the president until January 20th. That date used to be further into the future. It was in March. And this is where, America spoke. Hoover's out, but he was still the president from that November to that March. And so there was this consensus of like, wait, no, we need to move on. We need to give the president, the newly elected president, time to figure this out and get in there quickly. And they're going to move that up to January. And so that's that 20th Amendment. This also, I don't know if you followed the drama around this recent election in 2020, but there was a lot of conversation around when does the president? This is the answer. So the term of the president, vice president shall end at noon on the 20th day of January, and then the new president would become. That's pretty clear. So FDR's policies are going to be wrapped up in something that he'll call the New Deal. And we kind of break it down into three topics. So as you can see there, the New Deal is his name, and these are laws enacted to fight poverty during the Great Depression. Things are terrible for lots of people. So we break these into three main goals, and we call this the 3 R's: relief, recovery, and reform. Something to keep in mind as we go through all of this are, okay, what are the individual things that happen, but how do they fit into this broader movement of relief, recovery, or reform? So the definitions: relief is government checks and jobs to help people out of work. As I think the word relief means to you and me, I think of relief like if you get like a crazy sunburn, right? And you want to put some aloe on it just to calm things down. Does it prevent you from getting sunburned in the future? No. Does it do anything to truly help in the medium to long term? No. But it does kind of bring that heat down. Now, are you going to have to put more aloe on later? Yeah, probably. But it's that, okay, just real quick, we just stop, just bring it down. That's the key of relief. Then there's recovery. Recovery is what I would call more of a middle term. This is broader, more complicated stuff. So how can you stimulate industry and farming? So if relief is quick, help people right now. They need to eat. Then recovery is the how do we increase consumer confidence and get the whole economy back up and running. And then there's reform, fixing American economic institutions to avoid future depressions. How can we create stuff to safeguard us from the future? So if we want to take our sunburn, right? We have that aloe on that quick relief. Then there's our recovery. What things can we do to make sure that our skin can recover from this, or we don't do further damage by going out in the sun or whatever? And then reform would be, what mistakes did we make and how can we change that so we don't get this crazy sunburn in the future? In his inaugural address in 1933, he has a very famous quote here. And this is what we will call fear itself, right? So you probably have heard this before. Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance. And this is maybe a little too on the nose for us, given the current situations and circumstances, but he's becoming the president of a nation that is facing a catastrophic event. And his thing is to try and calm America down. There's hope. We can do this. It's difficult, but we need to take action. And so this is that leverage on the only thing to fear is fear itself. And so there's this big thing, and we'll talk about his fireside chats to try and communicate with the American public. It's okay. It'll be all right. We can do this. And think about how that's in sharp contrast with Hoover, who started with work harder. Like, what's the government going to do? Fix this? No. And so that's important for FDR to then signify this is how things will change in the future. We talk a lot about presidents, especially new presidents, on their first 100 days. And that really becomes a concept because of FDR. There really is no significance behind the first 100 days, right? It theoretically doesn't matter. But this is something that FDR is going to push very heavily in, we know we're in a crisis. Look at the steps we're going to take quickly to try and solve that crisis. We're not going to wait around. I know the government needs to act. You know the government needs to act, so we're going to do that. And so there is going to be some really significant things happening in this first 100 days. There is a special session in Congress at the beginning of FDR's presidency to focus on these things. And they basically do anything that FDR wants. And while we can be a little cynical about things now in our very partisan times, look at that return, right? 57%, let's just assume we're kind of spread evenly throughout America. That's a majority of most states, almost every state, saying this is the direction we want to go. And so there is a lot of, positive will towards, and political will towards supporting FDR. And most of the legislation is passed by this single Congress. The main things that happen real quick are a bank holiday. So there's a closing of banks for 4 days, and they only will reopen with government permission. And so the key on this is we need to get faith back in the banking institutions. We need to stop these runs on the bank. And so we're going to America, we're just going to close the banks for a little bit. It's a holiday, right? Don't be worried. Know that they're going to be closed. We are going to go in, investigate, and know that when we allow these banks to open, we are saying they're good. You can trust them. And this is a calculated risk, right? Because if you close the bank for these 4 days, let's say that when you open it up, people are like, oh crap, they closed it. I need to get my money out. There is a concern there. And FDR manages this to calm Americans. And when those banks open up, you don't see a panic rush on these banks. There's also a repeal of prohibition. So the 21st Amendment, which is, alcohol is legal again. We're not dealing with this. Also important to keep in mind that there is ways to make money off of alcohol if you're the federal government with taxation. And I don't know what the future holds, but we're dealing with a bit of an economic situation here. The government loves getting new taxes. Might there be something that gets legalized soon that could be taxed? We'll see. And as I mentioned, Roosevelt is going to talk with the American public. He does this over the radio, and these are called fireside chats. And this is something that we think of as kind of trivial. But this is really significant in that the president can have an outreach with like all of America simultaneously and reach directly to them. And that level of communication wasn't really something that had existed before. And this is something that FDR will use with great success. An example we can think about is, think about both under the, well, we'll say the beginning of the COVID situation with the Trump presidency and now with Biden dealing with coronavirus. There are a lot of pushes to have weekly or sometimes even every couple days, this panel come forward and talk about and keep America updated about the coronavirus and what's happening and things like that. The reason for that is the American people want information and the government wants to, control to some extent, but be able to have a hand in spreading information about, whatever crisis is going on. So, over 1933 to 34, let's look at some relief things that happen. And the most successful part of the New Deal are going to be these programs of relief. There will be government providing relief checks to 15% of Americans and a focus on creating jobs. So I want to be really clear, and we'll talk about this in a second with the recovery. When we have an economic recession, depression, whatever, people, so consumers, are desperately holding on to the money that they have. They don't have a lot of faith in what's coming up in the future or that they'll be able to get money in the future. Maybe these people have lost their jobs. Maybe they're just looking at people losing their jobs and they want to hold back. But when they hold back, they're not buying things and they're not stimulating the economy. So then the economy starts to shrivel and then they start companies start firing people and then people feel worse about consuming and then they don't. And you have this terrible spiral. So first, what you need to do is you need to get people the necessities they need to live. And that's this relief effort. The recovery effort is more about, okay, how do we get more money into the economy? So you have FARA, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration. This gave grants for state and local governments to set up soup kitchens and other things like that to help with the homeless. What I want you to keep in mind through all of this is, are we seeing parallels with the handling of this recession with the current recession because of COVID? So relief checks, yes, we've seen relief checks. Grants to state and local governments to help, we've seen some of that, and the current Biden plan is suggesting even more of that. There's the PWA, the Public Works Administration. Allocate money to state and local government to build roads, bridges, dams, and other public works. This creates jobs. So now we not only are cutting a check for a little bit, but we're giving people actual jobs that will sustain them and keep paying them. And these things, public works, bridges, roads, dams, those are all things that help America. Something you're seeing the Biden administration push is an incentive into the Department of Transportation to encourage the creation of infrastructure. We saw this during the 2009 Great Recession as well. There was about $1 trillion pushed into infrastructure by the Obama administration. One of the things being, that's an easy way to create jobs, but it's also stuff that gives you a return on the investment. Not only are you providing relief for people, you're getting maybe into a little bit of a recovery, right? If those people feel a little bit more confident in the economy and they have more money, maybe they spend more. But also roads, bridges, transportation, things like that, that infrastructure helps everyone. So you're getting a better return on your investment than just cutting checks and seeing where those go. Then you have the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, also very significant, employs young men on projects in federal lands and pays their families small monthly sums. So they give some money to these young men, but they also are sending a chunk of that money back to the families. So now not only are you supporting these young men who are then working on federal lands, which, great, that helps return on investment, but you also are getting money back to those families to support them and keep them fed and the house over their head. You have the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, hiring people to build dams, operate electric power plants in the Tennessee Valley, and this is going to bring electricity to thousands of people. There is a big push into electricity in more rural areas. One of the things to keep in mind, and you may have some impact on this if we want to, apply this to modern times, I think about companies like Amazon. So Amazon has their big distribution centers and they do some shipping and they're getting into more air travel and, actual ground travel. But there's something called the last mile. It can be very expensive to reach the last mile from, distribution center to a house, right? Because my house is a different spot than your house. Even though the goods may come from the same distribution center, physically getting it to my house is different than to your house. And so Amazon is starting to leverage out of this, and they're creating their own ways of getting their actual trucks to drive to individual houses, and potentially replacing their dependency on things like the USPS. There's also the CWA, the Civil Works Administration. This is added onto the Public Works Administration to hire laborers for temporary construction jobs funded by the federal government. So again, we're seeing the federal government spending money to get people jobs and immediate relief. Before we jump into the recovery, I really do want to stress there's going to be something that'll come out of this, the theory of deficit spending. So deficit spending is spending money that you, the government, technically do not have. And we see a lot of conversations around this during times of non-crises and times of crises. It is really important to stress, economically, if you are in a recession, and especially significant recessions like the Great Depression, the Great Recession, and arguably what we're seeing now, it is imperative that you invest money into stimulating the economy. The Herbert Hoover approaches of the world of we'll do a little bit, but maybe not a lot, it can lead to a slower recovery, which has more significant impacts over time. And so the federal government stepping in to spend a lot of money to try and get the economy jump-started, assuming the money is being spent in targeted ways, right? Not just casually putting money everywhere, but things that actually have good returns on investment, that is better for the long-term economy than just the government kind of sitting back and being like, I don't know, figure it out. For the recovery, remember, these are looking more at, medium-term things or the broader economy in general. These are going to be less successful than the relief. Again, we did mention relief will be the most successful. You will have the NRA, the National Recovery Administration, not that other NRA. This is an attempt to guarantee profits for businesses, fair wages and hours, and give workers the rights to organize, and this will ultimately fail. This will fail after 2 years when courts will declare that it is unconstitutional. We're not done seeing those courts. Those are going to be a bit of a problem for FDR. You see the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, similar to the NRA, but for farmers. Farmers are encouraged to reduce their production through government subsidies, but this also fails. And you have the FHA, the Federal Housing Administration. It ensures bank loans for building new houses, and this is to help the construction industry and also homeowners. So in looking at these, I really do want to point out how significantly or progressive we're seeing this New Deal attempt. We're talking about the right of workers to organize. We're talking about fair wages and hours, guaranteeing profits for businesses. We're talking about trying to work to reduce agriculture production, right? That helps control prices. I mean, these are pretty significant things, and they ultimately don't work. And so this is important when we look at the spectrum of the New Deal. We saw in World War I the things that actually get some progressive labor stuff, like an 8-hour workday. It's because of the leverage during a war, a time of crisis. Here's a time of crisis where this ultimately doesn't work, and it's the courts kind of pulling back the reins a little bit. I will say, when it comes to the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, there are currently subsidies in America where farmers are paid to not farm on their land. I worked with someone when I worked at another location who actually made money he purchased land with no intention of farming it, but the federal government gave him money to not farm on it. And this seems like a really poor waste of money, but keep in mind what's going on with farms, and has been going on with farms for a long time at this point. You are seeing farmers jacking up production because they need to make more money, and it's driving down the price of goods, which means they're not able to produce because they're going to go bankrupt. But food's also really important for America, and so the government kind of needs to keep this a little bit calmer. It's good when prices stay about the same and there aren't crazy fluctuations. And so there is some value in controlling or regulating the amount of production to try and help that pricing. And then there's the reform. These are, how can we not have this happen again? You have the Glass-Steagall Act, which increases regulation of banks, and this will lead to the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which I believe is something you probably have heard before. This guarantees individual bank deposits up to $250,000. And so this is to kind of help with that banking thing. What happened if you did all the right stuff and other people crashed your bank? Maybe your bank did some shady stuff. Maybe other people did a run on the bank and you got screwed even though you did the right things. This will help protect that. But also, don't put more than $250,000 in a solitary bank account because it's not protected above that. So just spread your money out if you ever have that kind of money. There's the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission. This is created to regulate the stock market and put restrictions on speculation. And it can also audit corporations to prevent fraud and insider trading. This is a little bit back in the news recently, and there's obviously still questions about whether or not the SEC truly is regulating the stock market effectively or as it should and whatever, right? There are things that change over time, but this is the actual creation of that. So again, Glass-Steagall targeting those bank issues, SEC targeting those stock issues. Then you have the second New Deal. This is going to go from 35 to 38. In the 1934 congressional elections, Democrats win overwhelmingly, which gives FDR a new resurgence of support, and he'll push for a more radical second New Deal. In relief, we'll see something called the WPA, the Works Progress Administration. Within its first year, it will employ 3.4 million workers who had previously been on government assistance. So think about government assistance even when we look at like today, right? So there are some increased unemployment insurance for people who have lost their jobs because of COVID. And that is the government giving them money because they have to be able to pay their bills. But if you can get off of that and into an actual job, you not only are getting paid, but you're also producing something that could have an impact. And so what the government's doing in this case is all sorts of works progress. You're going to see things even like paying artists to paint murals, paying writers. There's actually something, we'll get the slave narratives out of this because writers are going to be paid to travel throughout the American South and find really the last generation of living people who had been in slavery and ask them about what their life was like and document that. That comes about because of this WPA. Reform, you see the National Labor Relations and the Wagner Act. This guarantees workers the right to join a union and bargain collectively, and it will outlaw unfair business practices. And the NLRB is established to enforce the law. Again, courts are going to come into this later. And then there's reform, Social Security. That's probably something you've heard before. This is a federal insurance program based on automatic collection of payments through employers, and it will provide monthly payments to retired persons over the age of 65, although it is not 65 anymore. So one of the key problems in a relief movement is, all right, if we're paying people to work and we're paying people to dig ditches, build roads, that sort of thing, what are we doing about old people? And so Social Security works essentially by you working and paying into the system. And then there's a lot of complicated math around how it's formulated and how it pays out and all that. Feel free to Google that if you want. But basically, you don't get like a dollar for dollar return on your investment. It's based upon years of paying in and what percent, yada, yada. But you then, after the age of 67, you get Social Security payments every month from the government because you paid into the system. The problem with this currently is the way it works is, each person working pays a small chunk, and then employer pays a small chunk as well. And then that goes to support people who are retired. It really only works if you have a smaller chunk of people retired and a larger chunk of people working so that these people can pay smaller payments to pay them. The problem is we aren't having as many children. So this group working gets smaller and smaller, but we're living longer because we have better healthcare and medicine and technology and things like that. And then that gets this group bigger, and then this group is smaller, and that doesn't work. So good luck with your future in Social Security, because the numbers don't look good. Now, FDR does have critics. I don't want you to think that everyone was like, oh, FDR, we love him. There were people who criticized him from both the left and the right. You can see in this political cartoon called Step by Step, FDR is walking up the steps to become ultimately, as this says, a dictator. One of the things I really want to stress is I've told you since the beginning, let's watch federal government power increase over time. Remember, when we created America, we literally made a government that was like super state heavy, and like we didn't trust the federal government, and then that fell on its face. And then from then on, we've slowly been ramping up the amount of federal power that we think the government should have and expect the government to have. Remember, when COVID hit and this economy kind of crashed, people turned to the government for solutions. That's something that helps come about from this Great Depression. Herbert Hoover was like, don't come to me for this. Nope. That's going to be something the economy deals with. Businesses will figure it out. That's not our role. FDR will come in and change that. And from then on, people look to the government for controlling or regulating the economy. So keep an eye on this federal power. A lot of these things that FDR implements get pushed back because of too much power, but a lot of it does also continue on, and it's things we see today. But keep that in mind as what we're talking about currently in the political context. Take these conversations and put them back in the past. And there's a lot of people in the past who would be they'd push back against that. But that's because things get progressively more focused on federal power over time. One of FDR's most vocal critics is Huey Long. And this is someone who's going to compete against him from the left. So this is a Louisiana senator who has a big focus on share our wealth. That's his plan. And this is taxing all personal income over $1 million to provide each family with $2,500 income per year. Now that's in that dollars, not today. But let's see. Taxing the rich and giving an amount of money to every family every month. Universal basic income? That's an argument that we're currently talking about from a political thing. We're seeing a lot of stuff about stimulus checks and whether or not UBI or universal basic income should stick around. Democratic candidate Andrew Yang ran on this platform in the primary, and we're seeing this here during the Great Depression. This is his quote. Quote, "How many men ever went to a barbecue and would let one man take off the table what's intended for 9/10 of the people to eat? The only way you'll ever be able to feed the balance of the people is to make that man come back and bring back some of that grub that he ain't got no business with. Now, how are you going to feed the balance of the people? What's Morgan and Baruch and Rockefeller and Mellon going to do with all that grub? They can't eat it. They can't wear the clothes. They can't live in the houses." And this hinges really on tax the wealth, or the rich. There shouldn't be billionaires. They shouldn't exist, all of that. The point that he's making here, these people, these really, really rich people, they just can't literally spend all that money. So let's do something else with that to have benefits to it. And we're seeing, progressive candidates on the left come up with more of this push of get rid of billionaires, tax the rich, and then how should we reallocate that money? Huey Long will threaten to run as a third-party candidate, but he is going to be assassinated in 1935. America has a decently long history of radical politicians being assassinated. There are others who criticize FDR from more of the right. You have Southern Democrats, and you have Father Charles E. Coughlin and Dr. Francis E. Townsend. Just to focus on them real quick, we spent a lot of time in the last 6 or so years talking about fake news and, oh my God, the internet, and people don't even access the truth anymore. And we saw a lot of that come with the 2020 election, and just the lies kind of spewed about that and how much people saw and read those and the spread, especially through social media. And we're like, oh my God, what a crisis in democracy. And it is. It's also happened before. The radio is going to explode in popularity, and you're going to have these people in particular who are aggressively anti-Semitic, and they're going to be pushing all sorts of conspiracy theories and all sorts of what we would call fake news. So, yeah, America kind of has experienced stuff like this before. The real difference is now it doesn't take that much for you to become the person who has a massive outreach. That's the difference today. There's also going to be a court packing controversy. The Supreme Court will declare 2 parts of the New Deal unconstitutional, and FDR gets worried that the New Deal will become less effective if the Supreme Court is, just making stuff unconstitutional. And so, to try and increase that support, he proposes a system to reorganize the courts by allowing the president to add an additional justice for each current justice over the age of 70 and a half. This would let him add 6 more justices. When we talk about court packing, especially we've heard some stuff about this recently, Court packing is technically referring to the idea of adding additional people to the court, and it kind of feels more like this idea, right? One president being able to put in a bunch of justices. Now, there is wiggle room in the Constitution for changing the number of justices. It is something that the federal government can do. So we have to walk this line in this conversation of, I mean, we changed this number of Supreme Court justices to 9. So, like, it is something that can happen. The question is, can America decide on a solution moving forward? And we'll see. Republicans and many Democrats will reject this idea and would not vote for this controversial measure because, I mean, it is really controversial. It's a way that the federal government, specifically the executive, has even more of an impact into the Supreme Court, and there's supposed to be a level of checks and balances between the three. Now, the president can already appoint justices, so it's not perfect, but there is supposed to be a little bit more separation. And so that's something that if the number of justices does change in the future, is it going to hinge on something that allows for it to become more or to decrease in partisanship? Who knows? Now let's look at what the long-term effects of the New Deal were. Political. This is the first attempt by the federal government to take responsibility for the welfare of American people. And there is no argument that you can make that is historically sound, sitting here now in 2021, that has decreased over time. That has simply increased. It's increased on the left, it's increased on the right. There is an expectation by people that the American government is going to support the American people. We will see this change over time. There are ebbs and flows, but go back through anything that's happened recently, everyone of all political stripes has argued that the federal government plays a part in helping the American people and specifically their welfare. FDR's leadership is also going to unify a new voting coalition for the Democratic Party. And we're going to see some changes with this, especially as we get towards the civil rights movement. But this base is going to be unions, African Americans, immigrants, and poor voters. Now, we don't see that exactly continue on forever. We see a lot of changes with that even just today, but think of that base moving forward because there'll be things that happen in the future that change that, but that's what will become this Democratic base or these Roosevelt Democrats. When it comes to social impacts, you're going to see help offered to new groups of people, the elderly, single mothers, and disabled citizens. We see those things continue on. There's WIC programs, women, infant, children, to target mothers. There are Social Security things for people who have disabilities. And obviously Social Security, like we mentioned. Eleanor Roosevelt will campaign to help minorities. She is going to kind of drastically change our expectations around what a first lady does. She is going to be very involved in things, and we'll see some first ladies in the future to not do that and some to continue in that idea. But this isn't really equal. There is still some racism at heart in the New Deal. There's unequal pay for women and African Americans. African Americans are frequently the last hired and the first fired. So you're the last ones to get a part of these new jobs, and if anything goes bad, you're the first one to pay the consequences. There's also going to be things that specifically are targeting African Americans disproportionately. And so when it comes to Social Security, one of the things that doesn't qualify as wages for Social Security is domestic help. Throughout the South, you are going to see a large number of families, middle class and up, who have black workers working for them domestically. That's usually going to be involved around housekeeping and things like that. There is a provision out of Social Security that those jobs are not eligible for Social Security. So now their wages are not being held back, but then when these people retire, they're not going to get to access Social Security because they weren't paying into the system. Economically, it does help relieve unemployment. There are some long-term economic reforms, but it does not end the Great Depression. The thing that really ends the Great Depression is going to be World War II.